The biggest problem on the right in general, and that's been true for as long as I've been in this world, is personnel. We don't have enough smart people, I mean, honestly. And the problem is that not so smart people are worse than no people at all. And we also have lots of not so smart people. There was this study that came out on, and like going back a long time, so not just Trump, how many Democrats do Republican administrations hire? Yeah, you know the study. Versus how many Republicans do Democratic administrations hire? And like going back, like I think all the way to Reagan, like Republicans hire many more Democrats and vice versa.
4 times as many.
4 times. Well, there you go. And it's not a, by and large, I don't think it's a like a cowardice or like they're selling us out kind of thing. It's a personnel issue. It's like we don't have the people on our side to be like, you know, deputy assistant secretary of nuclear safety or whatever. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of these jobs are like technical jobs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the biggest problem I think we have.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by...
After a long time, Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
Yeah, you had another baby, Nicholas Sawyer Solheim Jr.
Yep.
Cutie pie. We finally got to get back together to tape an episode of this show. It's been a very busy few months, but we're glad to be back. Thank you guys, as always, for joining for yet another episode. We had a fantastic foreign guest today. Yes, we do like some people who are not from here. But before I get to that, be sure, as always, to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything we have cooking as an organization. You can sign up for the fall series of AM Fridays. That's our lunch series on Capitol Hill for interns and junior staff. It's surprisingly oversubscribed this time. So if you sign up, you might get a chance at a vanishingly small number of seats available. That's free lunches with leading public policy experts to talk about how this town actually works and the 101 of the America First agenda. You can also apply for our spring fellowship soonish, I think. It might not be up right away, but very soon you'll be able to come join us here in spring in Washington, D.C., where hopefully there will be somewhat of a regime change. But now I'll go to our guest for this week. This week we had on Pascal-Emmanuel Gobry, who is the founder and CEO of Sphere Media and publisher of PolicySphere, a media outlet dedicated to right-of-center policy professionals in D.C. He is a writer, an analyst, and entrepreneur. He was previously a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and has written at numerous publications such as The Atlantic, The Week, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, First Things, Commentary Magazine, and more. Forbes previously honored him as one of their 30 under 30, so I assume he's going to be found in prison very soon. Previously, he's co-created the technology and analysis service BI Intelligence and worked in venture capital and investment banking. He holds a Master's of Science from HEC Paris. And we brought Pascal to answer 2 questions for us. One, what the heck is going on in France? Because we can't help but have foreigners mansplain the politics of the country that they're from. But more importantly, how exactly he sees the policy ecosystem in the United States. You know, this is one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time, is how the meta-analysis of politics in DC actually could be engaged in. And I think being not quite from here and not living here, Pascal actually has the advantage of a little bit of critical distance. He knows the players, but he isn't sort of enmeshed in on a day-to-day basis and doesn't have the sort of personal commitments that would prevent him from being a sort of dispassionate viewer of and thinker and commentator on how these things are going. So we highly recommend that you go follow PolicySphere, but I thought it was a fantastic episode. Nick, what did you think?
Thought it was great. I really enjoyed talking about how everyone in the new right needs to stop posting and to work harder. That was great. Always a good reminder. And man, I am really black-pilled by the state of migration in France.
Yeah.
That section was
if you want
very depressing.
If you want to find out how the average Frenchman feels about Algeria, you can tune in for a very particular segment of the show. We'll go now to Pascal-Emmanuel Gobry. Pascal, otherwise known as Peg, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We always like to hear about where our guests came from and what exactly brought them to the point that they are today. You have an interesting one that's more international than many of our guests are. Tell us the tale. Why do you care so much about what happens here in the United States, being a Frenchman?
That's I still don't know, actually. No, I became fascinated by American politics in like the mid 2000s when I was in college. I was bored, and French politics were extremely boring. My family had been active in politics, as we were discussing before the show, but French politics were incredibly boring, and I was very socially conservative. I had been brought up Catholic, and like social conservatism in France, as you may know, is not a very powerful force, at least not politically, culturally, but not politically. And I found out about this country where there's like, 100 million people who are Christian and who disagree with like modern liberalism, or at least aspects of it. And I just found the whole thing fascinating. Mm-hmm. And for your younger listeners, they may not remember this, but the mid 2000s was also the golden era of blogs. And so you could just show up to somebody's blog in the comments, and like the comment section was civilized. It was like people writing whole paragraphs incredibly, and like having discussions, and like you could literally just show up to somebody's blog and be part of the conversation. And it became like a hobby to me. And I wrote for a blog that the most savvy among our listeners will have heard of, which was called The American Scene, which was a group blog that was started by Ross Douthat and Ryan Salam, but had many, many contributors over the years. And like eventually it was Ryan. It's all his fault. It was Ryan who was like, oh, well, do you want to write a post for us? That's literally how it began. And it sort of snowballed. People offered me to write more articles, and I kept finding it interesting. Eventually people offered to pay me to write articles, which was crazy.
Yeah.
And it eventually turned into a profession. And so I became a journalist writing mainly about American politics and tech from Paris. This led to a long affiliation with a wonderful place called the Ethics and Public Policy Center. So I got deeper into the world of Washington, and yeah, here I am.
But where exactly in France did you grow up? In Paris, or?
So my family has roots in rural Burgundy, but I grew up mostly in Paris, but we sort of traveled back and forth.
And so does American politics have purchase in the imagination of the French, or is it like in the UK, it's like people know the names of American politicians. It's like it's sometimes more than they know their own. Yeah. Is it the same in France, or is it more distant?
It's more distant. It's definitely more distant. It's changed a little bit because of Obama. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Obama. Where like some people, and also because you have all of these 22-year-olds. So basically the business model of the press is broken everywhere, but particularly in France because it's a smaller country. And so the advertising market is smaller. And so French newspapers hire 22-year-olds to essentially put whatever is the most read article on the Washington Post and the New York Times through Google Translate. And that's how French people get their news about American politics. So it's a disaster.
Yeah.
But it's pretty funny because I will have friends who out of nowhere will be like, what do you think is going to happen with the swing voters in Pennsylvania? And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But it's still, France has always been, for better or worse, a kind of self-regarding country. And so it's less, in the UK, people follow US politics like crazy, but it's not as bad.
It's like having a fantasy football team.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you sort of were a writer and engaged in the public conversation in the United States that way. Having known a little bit about what freelance journalism pays, surely that wasn't all you were doing. What else have you been involved with up until this point?
Well, so you could actually make a reasonable living at the end of during the 2010s.
Yeah.
Because the internet hadn't completely destroyed like legacy media's business models, and some people were investing because they thought they could make money on the internet, which turns out nobody can. but they thought they could. And so I actually made a pretty good living for like a few years. And yeah, I mean, I've also done some political consulting, and things like that. But it's mostly been journalism and EPPC.
Got it. And so you've started a new publication, which we'll talk about later, but very quickly tell us the story of the genesis of why you decided to start it.
Yeah. So PolicySphere. So I started this kind of as a hobby in 2019. I did like a weekly newsletter on, what was in the world of policy, and it was like links and my commentary, and like it took off, like people loved it. And I didn't have the time at some point to continue it as like a hobby. And so I sort of filed the idea away in like a piece of my mind. And, when I decided to start a company, I sort of unearthed the idea. And so the idea of PolicySphere is we're a media company covering the policy world for professionals of the center and right of center working in Washington, D.C. So we cover domestic U.S. federal policy, meaning not state policy, not national security or foreign policy, except as it impacts domestic policy. So we have some China stuff, some trade stuff. But the basic idea is if you're a center, right of center policy professional in Washington, D.C., you want something that covers sort of what's going on in that world. There's nobody doing it. I used to say there's nobody on the right doing it, but really there's nobody doing it. The people who do subscribe tell us that they find it very useful. And so it's been an exciting ride.
I think it's pretty unique that you, a Frenchman, are informing all of these people that work on Capitol Hill about, what's happening in this town. What is like uniquely positioned you to be able to do that, as opposed to, I mean, I get it, regime media, they're all terrible, but like...
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's for other people to say. I mean, certainly, we French, we love lecturing everybody else about what they're doing wrong. Maybe the being French thing gives me like an outsider perspective, which is useful, although I don't think of it that way. There's sometimes, when it's really like relevant, I will take an example from France or Europe and say, oh, there's this thing in France and like it's different than this. And it may be a bad example because there's a lot of bad policy in France. Like it's, don't think that I want to make the US more like France, except in some very specific respects, like food and wine. I'm joking. Yeah, maybe the outsider perspective gives me an added value. I don't really know. I think of myself as pretty American, actually.
Despite that, whenever we have a guest from another country on the show, we feel the need to have them mansplain their own country's politics to our audience, because people are always, it's funny. It's what's the meme, right? It's, there's something going on in another part of the world, and half of Twitter suddenly becomes an expert. Right. And so you actually know a little bit about what's going on in politics in France, and are even close to it personally yourself. It feels like the last moment that everyone was paying attention to all of this, Marine Le Pen's party had become the largest party in France, and there were dirty tricks going on with the left to prevent her from gaining power. Just give us an overview of what exactly is going on today. I know there's been some recent developments with who's been picked as prime minister and such. What's going on? What's the state of the French political scene right now?
So the state of the French political scene is chaos. So basically, we had European elections, which are proportional list elections. Mm-hmm. And so the National Rally came in first. And then Emmanuel Macron decided to call early elections of the lower house of parliament, which he can do under the constitution, but which nobody was expecting him to do.
This was like the same week or the week after, a week before that Rishi Sunak did it in the UK. So
that's true.
Like everyone's
that's true. Yeah. The two elections happened very close to each other. And so the lower house of parliament, the elections there are by district, and it's a 2-round system where everybody who gets more than 12.5% of registered voters in the first round gets into the second round, and whoever comes first in the second round wins. And so you have a game of coalitions where you can essentially like choose to withdraw from the second round and endorsed a better placed candidate to make another candidate lose, basically. And basically all of the other parties decided to do what they call a Front Républicain, to desist, to withdraw their candidates in favor of the better placed candidate from the Front Républicain, to ensure that the National Rally would have the fewest amount of seats possible. And also, I mean, they got they didn't do quite as well in the election in terms of votes but there was also this institutional stuff. And so basically now the French Parliament, or the lower house, the National Assembly, is like split in three blocks. You have the left bloc, which is dominated by the far left party. You've got the centrist bloc with the traditional, which includes the traditional quote unquote conservative party. And then 1/3 is the National Rally. And of course, you need a majority to have a government. So France has a mixed presidential and parliamentary system. So there's a president who's elected every 5 years, and he appoints a prime minister, but the prime minister must have the confidence of the lower house of the parliament. So it's kind of like the British system if the queen was actually the queen. Or the king now.
Yeah.
And so the king would have the king's powers, but he would have to have a majority in the House of Commons to be able to appoint the prime minister he likes to actually carry out the policies he likes. And so if you have a majority, it all works well. If you don't have a majority, it's chaos. And like people have been trying to do a lot of math because, you know, I'm generalizing, all of these 1/3 are like coalitions of smaller parties.
Except for National Rally,
National Rally has a small sort of traditional right ally who has 15 seats, but yeah, basically National Rally is a bloc. And so like you can do them, there are simulators online. You can try to do the math to get a majority together. It's impossible. Because, a bunch of these parties have said, well, we won't be in coalition with these guys, and we won't. And so like, if you try, it's like somebody designed it with an algorithm to make it the most complicated. So the bloc that came in first was the left bloc. They demanded that Macron appoint their guy as prime minister. Well, first they had to pick a guy because, again, it's a coalition of parties. So that took weeks. They picked this unknown lady that nobody had ever heard of. And then Macron decided not to, which is perfectly entitled to. He essentially said, which is smart politics, like, okay, you find me somebody who can get a majority and I'll appoint him. And they were like, no, you have to appoint our guy. It's like, you don't have a majority. Like, what's the point of being appointed if you're going to have a vote of no confidence the next week? But, it's the left. They don't, it's like, so that happened. And then he's appointed this guy, Michel Barnier, who's like this senior. He was the EU Brexit negotiator. He was an EU commissioner, and before that, he was he spent a long time in French politics as a member of the sort of traditional right party, not the populist right. And so, apparently, he's now like trying to negotiate to put a majority together. I have no idea how it's going to happen.
Is National Rally going to play ball?
I don't know. There are rumors that. So one of the things you have in parliamentary politics is something that's called a confidence and supply agreement. And the idea there is, you have this bloc in the lower house and you say, we're not going to join your coalition, but we're also not going to vote against it. And so there are rumors that the National Rally agreed to that. I don't think they've been confirmed. I don't really know, to be honest. It's so hard to keep track of, and it's not my day job. I don't see how else it would work, but I also don't see Macron going for that. So we'll see, I guess.
One of the things that really struck people when National Rally did surprisingly well for a, serious right-wing European party is how young a lot of its members are.
Right.
Whether it's Bardella or you see these videos of the new MPs lining up inside Parliament. Yeah. They're in their 20s and 30s. and in general, that it seems like a lot of French young people voted for them. I think it's probably the one thing that stands really far outside the imagination of American right-wingers, the idea that you can have young right-wingers as a central force in politics. What exactly is going on sociologically in France right now that made that possible? I mean, what are the salient issues? What are the things along which politics actually breaks down?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know how politically incorrect you want to get, but there are fairly good explanations as to why young people are voting for the National Rally en masse. It's because it's the cohort that has the biggest number of immigrants. And often if they go to public school, they went to school with those immigrants. And schools that have a high number of immigrants are also schools that typically have violence, have, all those sorts of behaviors that are associated with the type of immigrants. Obviously, I'm not saying that all immigrants everywhere are bad, but in the main, French immigration is immigration from Muslim countries, from sub-Saharan African countries. And it's sort of, France is like the poster child of like what not to do in terms of immigration policy, and has been for 30 years. So it's pretty bad. And because of the demographics, like young people are especially exposed to that kind of stuff in the way that boomers tend not to be. So that's why the National Rally is doing so well among the young. The other thing that was striking about these elections is people always say, oh, the National Rally, it's like this populist working class party. This was the first election where they got past 30% in every income bracket. So like this year, 30% of people who are in like managerial positions in a company, for example, 30 to 35% of them voted for the National Rally, whereas just 2 years ago, it would have been like 15% or 10%. So that's a huge shift. And so it's a party that's really becoming much more representative of French society overall. And it's really, I mean, all of this stuff about populist or extremists, it's basically becoming like the new conservative party. Like the traditional conservative party sort of governed to the center for many, many decades. And like the National Rally is just evolving into the new sort of mainstream, normal conservative party.
Has that involved policy concessions?
Yeah. I mean, they have gone much more mainstream on economics.
What does that mean? Because I know that in previous elections, part of the tension was that they were quite left-wing on economics. So like explain the sort of economic landscape.
Well, so for example, they've dropped ideas about leaving the EU or dropping the euro. They sort of don't really talk about trade anymore because trade is a EU competency and they think Europe is toxic for them, so they just don't talk about it. And they talk about reducing regulations. They talk about cutting taxes for businesses. They talk about cutting taxes in general. So they've adopted that sort of like whole menu of rhetoric, which is like the traditional conservative rhetoric everywhere. The one big policy, quote unquote, populist policy that they've kept is returning the age of retirement to 60. So now it's 64. And they wanted to go back to 60. But even then they added so many like fine prints that it would be like a tweak to the retirement system, actually, if you look at the fine print.
So bringing this around to, American policy and I guess looking at what America could become, has a lot of National Rally's success come from the migration issue in particular? I'm presuming the answer is yes. And then paint a picture for us, like, how bad is it really in France, and what does that portend for, our limitless migration here in the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, after South Africa, which is not directly the problem in South Africa is not directly migration, but if you want to look at the future of the U.S., I mean, the situation is, the crime rate we don't have racial statistics in France; they're illegal, but we have statistics.
Really?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well,
it's illegal.
if you don't have a First Amendment, you can just ban things.
Yeah.
So it's illegal.
So there's no like national like government demography operation? Like they don't take those statistics in a census or anything like that?
No, they do, just not race.
Okay.
You're not allowed to ask somebody you're not allowed to ask a respondent their race, and you're not allowed to publish statistics that group people by race.
Wow, interesting.
But we do have statistics on religious affiliation. We do have statistics on immigrant origin. We do have statistics on country of origin. The guy from Senegal, conceivably he could be white. We don't know. And like the statistics are on the crime rate, on the unemployment rate. So, for example, I'm pretty sure that's the correct statistic. 50% of people of Algerian origin are not in the labor force.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you explain the Algeria thing? Like I know a little bit about like what the role that Algeria plays in the French imagination is, but like what's the geographic dynamic there?
Well, so Algeria is right across from France, across from the Mediterranean. And so it's a former colony. One of the provisions of the independence treaty was visa-free travel between the two countries. Because at the time, there was like 1 million French people, meaning white and Jewish, European French people, living in Algeria, and it was thought that they would stay there. And so the idea was they would be able to come back home to visit their families or their cousins or whatever. Of course, in a very famous episode of ethnic cleansing, which is totally not famous because the victims were white, the Algerian government threw out all of these people. And famously, they used the slogan, La valise ou le cercueil, so the suitcase or the coffin.
Whoa.
Yeah. Talk about mass deportation.
Yeah.
And you had a very big Jewish community there as well that was totally uprooted. The Jews who had been there for like 1,000 years, but assimilated into French culture, received French citizenship. That's Eric Zemmour's family. So these people tend to be super patriotic and super French. So you had a treaty with visa-free travel. In the 60s and 70s, the economy was roaring, and so we imported not migrant in the sense of today, but like immigrant workers on work visas to go work in the factories. And this is the story of immigration in France. So in the 70s, the French government passed a decree allowing Middle Eastern worker or North African workers to bring their wives and their kids. And the thinking was this would be a nice benefit for them, but very few will take advantage of it because they're here to work, make some money, go back home. And of course, all of them wanted to bring their families and sort of live in France permanently. And so the government and they reversed it. And then the French Supreme Court struck it down. And so...
On what grounds?
Oh, this is wonderful. They invented something called the right to a normal family life. And this has since become part of EU law. So EU law has this thing called the right to a normal family life. And this means that if an immigrant wants to bring his spouse over, he has like a constitutional right to do so.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's how immigration, in particular from former French colonies in Africa, went from being controlled work-related migration to being just pure population movement and totally unvetted because, it's just based on who you're related to, right? It's the chain migration thing that you also have in the US. And so that's how things got worse and worse.
Yeah.
I want to hear more about the crime. You were just starting to talk about crime statistics and then...
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, and I know I'm going to get fact-checked if I get a number wrong, but the one I recently saw is like 90% of thefts in public transport are foreign origin people. I mean, the stats are really crazy. The stats in sexual assault are very crazy. I mean, just people of immigrant origin disproportionately commit crime relative to the rest of the population. That's a statistical fact that's been demonstrated in official statistics very plainly.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, Macron came into power as someone who sort of broke the existing partisan consensus of France. What's the incentive structure for someone like him to allow this to continue? I thought he was a Jupiterian president. Like, why wouldn't he put a stop to it?
I mean, that's a very good question, and it's hard not to get into conspiratorial mode to answer that question, because like a president who did put an end to it, which would be very easy because we have a great tool in the French Constitution, which is the referendum. And so this is like the dream of the French right. Sarkozy said he would do it. He didn't. So the president can call a referendum on not any issue, but basically any issue. And sort of break those, reverse, like that has more value than, for example, Supreme Court decisions, which the law can change, and so on and so forth. And so the dream of the conservatives was always, let's get a good president and he's going to call a referendum. And what is certain is that referendum would be like, the polling is very clear going back decades. It's like 65%, 70%. If you had like basic anti-immigration provisions, like an immigration moratorium, extending the length of time it gets to be naturalized, no more welfare for immigrants. Like there's like a menu of like 10 things. And that referendum would pass, and whoever did that referendum would like be, would be Napoleon. Like they would dominate politically. They would be incredibly popular. And so, it's a mystery of like contemporary democracies, which is, why do politicians refuse to do things that are popular? Like the one thing that they're supposed to be good at is like doing things that are popular, for better or worse. And like, they won't even do that. It's a big mystery.
Well, but I mean, in the U.S. context, there's all sorts of obvious reasons why, which is that, people rise up through party systems that constrain them institutionally in all sorts of ways. I suppose what's just strange about Macron is that he didn't owe anyone anything theoretically when he came in. Theoretically. And so, I mean, I guess there's no answer to it, but I mean, it seems like he could cement his place in history in a serious way and just chooses not to on a regular basis.
One of the things that I'm curious about here is like, why is there such a difference between the way, Americans and the French think about immigration, right? Like, if we had the ability to do a referendum, on like an immigration moratorium,
right,
I wouldn't expect that would be nearly as popular in the United States as it is in France.
Yeah. Although you might get a majority.
Maybe.
Moratorium, maybe not, but like strong reduction, like something like the Raise Act.
But even if
Raise Act could get 65,
even if there's like a 20% difference, right, in like the American context versus the French context, like that's a pretty sizable difference. Like, do the French just hate immigrants more? Like, what's the? That's what I'm trying to get at. Like root causes here, man.
The nature of the immigrants changes. I mean, the nature is not the right term, but like, you think of the average Mexican immigrant to the U.S., maybe he shouldn't be here. Maybe he doesn't have enough skills to like contribute economically to the level that we would like. But he's a Christian.
Some I assume are good people.
Like, no, like, I mean, if you talk to, for example, like people wonder why are so many like right-wing Christians so soft on immigration in the U.S. Like in large part is because like they know like a really wholesome Mexican family that attends their church, right?
Yeah.
Nobody knows a wholesome immigrant in France. That's not true.
Yeah.
I in fact know one. That's it.
Yeah.
Like, no, the way that the immigration, the countries that people come from, the civilization that they come from, means that they've adapted a lot less well to life in the U.S. And now that, you've got Haitians coming over, like you're about to find out what it's really like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for another podcast, we can have a conversation about the French deep state, because the French deep state is a lot more based than the American deep state. And so the former head of the French intelligence service has essentially like rededicated his life to becoming an anti-immigration activist.
Really?
Yes. Yes. And he's on the board of the top restrictionist think tank in France, and he gives interviews like every month. And so he did a lot of studies on that. And his sort of rule of thumb is he says it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, by which he means 1/3 are assimilated, meaning they're good citizens, they're patriots. 1/3 are what he calls integrated, meaning they don't do crime, they have jobs, they pay taxes, but they don't feel a special sense of attachment to the country. And 1/3 are people who are either deeply dysfunctional in terms of crime or unemployment, and there are many, are sort of have deep Islamist beliefs that make them sort of radically hostile to the civilization that France comes from.
Yeah.
And so that's a kind of good sort of rough breakdown of like what it's like. And so 1/3, you're talking about 1/3 of like 15 million people. So that's like 5 million people out of a population of 70. So that's like close to 10% of the population of a country that actively hates the country. Like actively hates. Yeah. Wow. Your face is a pretty good, yeah.
Fascinating. So prognosticate for us what's going to happen over the next 3 or 4 years in France.
3 or 4 years, I have no idea. I have no idea what's going to happen over the next 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Like if you told me like 2 weeks ago, Macron is going to appoint Michel Barnier to prime minister, I would have been like, what? And if you told me 3 months ago, he's going to dissolve the National Assembly if he loses the European Parliament elections, I would have said, you're crazy. Yeah. I mean, most likely Marine is going to lose. Marine is going to run, and then she's going to lose, and she's going to do like 45% in the runoff. And then it'll be up to Bardella, who may win the next time around because he's very charismatic, and it's a bit like Marine Le Pen is a very talented politician, but many people are turned off by her name, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When is the presidential election?
2027. So it's every 5 years. So.
And when's the next parliamentary election?
Whenever Macron decides.
Yeah.
So you can't call a new election within less than 1 year after a previous election. So theoretically, he can call a new election in 8 months now?
Yeah.
And most people assume he will because the parliament is complete chaos, which leads me to believe he won't. He seems to be wired that way.
Yeah.
But nobody knows.
All very, very interesting. But we'll go back across the pond now. I think it's really interesting, the thesis of the publication that you decided to start, because understanding public policy as an industry is something that American conservatives are very bad at. And I think part of it stems from the fact that there is this overwhelming deference to the idea that politics is a marketplace of ideas.
Right.
And that we're in high school debate club, and that's the best ideas win.
Yes.
Why is that wrong? And why are you so interested in the public policy industry as a unit of analysis on its own accord?
That's a very good idea. That's a very good question. Why is this wrong? Because of money. That's a lot of it. Because of money, also because of institutional blockages. The problem is you need to get to 60 votes in the Senate. You need to get a majority in the House, and you need a signature from the president. Mm-hmm. Each of these things is extremely complicated. For each of these things, you need to put a different coalition together. Mm-hmm. And so it's not about having the best arguments. It's having the best arguments and then being able to put together a coalition that will support idea X. And so that leads me to the answer to your second question. Why is public policy so interesting? To my mind, is because it's what upstream of the stuff that everybody focuses on, which is legislation and new regulations and new EOs and things like that. Like every bill, maybe not every bill, but like 90% of the bills in Congress were originally a think tank report, right? And so if you want to understand the future of the political conversation, at least in this town, you need to understand the policy space. And that's the insight that I founded the company on.
How do you think our listeners can best understand the difference between how the left policy ecosystem is organized versus the right policy ecosystem is organized?
Well, I'm not an expert on how the left policy system is organized. Well, the first thing is they have a lot more money than us. And they make better use of that money because they have zero philosophers. And I love philosophers. I majored in philosophy in college. God forgive me. And it's wonderful, and it's part of what makes being on the right so fun and interesting, which we can't stop having these philosophical arguments, right? After 5 minutes of talking about tax rates, we're talking about Burke and Mill and whoever else.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. And anyway, we can't do it any other way because we're wired that way. Mm-hmm. But the operationalizing of those philosophical arguments is something that we struggle with. How do you get from like the big idea down to a policy proposal, down to something that can get through legislature at the state level or at the federal level? That's where the cart sort of, and then how do you get the administrative state to implement it? And then like everything is gone. Yeah. And so, yeah, I would say that that's where we really struggle. And like the left, they understand power because they're wired about power. Their entire thing is accumulating more power. And so they sort of naturally understand in a completely non-theorized way, in the way that, you know, like a super gifted like tennis player, you know, can't talk about the game, but like he sees where the ball is going. They understand very well how to operationalize an idea and then use that idea to accumulate more power, which they then use to operationalize more ideas and so on and so forth.
There's this interesting thread that goes around of people on the right saying that, you know, oh, the left succeeds. They're so much more organized because they don't eat each other, right? They're like, they have like mass party loyalty.
Yeah.
But I've also seen this thread go around in leftist circles where they say the same thing about us. Which is more true?
That's a good question. I don't remember who it was. I think it was Yuval Levin who said something to the effect, one of the striking things about American politics right now is that both sides think they're losing. And both sides think it's like 5 minutes to midnight, right? The Trumpenwaffen is coming to abolish American democracy.
Yeah.
And, you know, the communists are, you know, they're importing new voters. And so we're no longer going to have competitive elections. Okay, there may be truth to the second. But it's not completely true. Like, you know, probably some illegals vote in elections, but it's probably not millions, not yet. And even less in purple states, right? They probably all vote in deep blue states where it makes no difference. Anyway, there's this weird thread, and you know, it's like it's always the mimetic thing. Like you think that the other guy is like, you know, on it, and like you only see his strengths, and you don't know that, you know, he's had a terrible night last night. His wife is leaving him. His dog hates him. And he's in a bad mood, and so actually he's having a terrible time. So, yeah, they tend to sort of magnify our strengths, and we tend to magnify their strengths. The difference is, objectively, they are winning, like on every possible metric. Whether obviously on social issues, like they're winning on everyone, and even on trend stuff, you know, we won some sort of tactical victories, but we're not winning the broader argument. But also, if you look at traditional conservative measures like size of government, size of the deficit, size of the national debt, amount of pages of regulations in the U.S. code, like we're just objectively losing. So clearly they are better than us, at least at some things. And there's this entire other like meta question of should we copy them, or is the playing field different for them in some way that actually copying them is a mistake because we can't. I don't know about that. I sort of go back and forth on that question, but the point is they're better than us at the mechanics of operationalizing public policy in a way that cashes out to policy gains, right? So under Republican administrations, the size of government increases. Under Republican administrations, public acceptance for pick your social issue increases, right? So,
how would you describe the state of the right of center policy ecosystem right now in terms of its strengths, its deficiencies, gaps, and oversupply?
Oversupply. You want me to make enemies? Is that it?
Yeah,
that's a leading question.
Just like what,
Your Honor.
What does it look like right
I'd
now?
like to tell my sources, you all suck. You're terrible at your jobs. You should all be fired.
Yeah.
And then I will have nothing to write about and no subscribers to read it. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm actually optimistic. There's a lot of do nothing stuff, but a lot more people are sort of understanding what I just said. So to take an example, and a shout out to my previous employer, the Ethics and Public Policy Center. This is very inside baseball, but
it's an inside baseball podcast.
Yeah. So EPBC has been around since the early 70s, which is very old for a Washington think tank. There's some that are older, but that's pretty old.
Older than Heritage, right?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, Heritage is like mid 70s. Yeah. I think only AEI and RAND are older among the big ones. Maybe Hoover, I don't know. It used to be, so the proposition for conservative think tanks in that era was essentially we're being discriminated against in universities, so we're going to start our own like graduate research centers. It wasn't about driving policy. It was about fixing the problem of like smart scholars at Ivy League universities being discriminated against for tenure and things like that. And so EPPC always had this sort of very academic bent, which is fine. But under Ryan Anderson, the new president who came in a few years ago, who I interviewed for PolicySphere, and it was one of our best read articles, he kept a lot of that philosophical stuff. And that's one of the things that I love about EPPC, which you can have like a guy in one office working on tax rates, and then the guy in the next office is working on like the economic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
And I actually love that.
Yeah.
But Ryan was like, all right, he introduced the idea of producing model legislation, for example. He introduced the idea of doing state level policy because a lot of this stuff gets operationalized at the state level. As you know, on big tech stuff, and especially child online safety. So the COSA bill that is now in front of Congress, which has a good shot of passing, was originally state bills. It's after Utah and I think a couple other states passed similar bills that it became an idea in Congress, and EPBC did a lot of work to drive that. So that's one example. And I think a lot more people are sort of realizing that there's like this continuum from like Thomas Aquinas philosophy to an EO, and like there's an entire continuum that goes through the 50-page report, the press release, the congressional fight, and the process, and and like you need to be good at that entire spectrum if you want the process to eventually cash out in like real policy change. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. I mean, obviously, you always want things to get better, but I'm optimistic.
How do you handicap the process by which the new right, which had its sort of genesis moment when President Trump won in 2016, has gone about the task of institutionalizing itself in policy in Washington? 9 years in, are we where we should be? Ahead in some places, behind in others? How would you describe that specific?
That's such a good question. I mean, you always want to be ahead of where you are, and you always look backwards and look and see the missed opportunities. But that's a bad way of thinking. I think we're doing good. There's different things. There's like the think tank world, there's the media world, and then there's Congress. I think the think tank world has like adopted a lot of these ideas, or at least, if not adopted, sort of realized, oh, okay, there's like a huge part of our coalition that wants these things, and so we can't just ignore them. Or, there are real problems here with, for example, China. And so, we should address them in some way. And so even if they're not fully on board with the new right, which is an amorphous thing anyway, they're at least like thinking about it and taking it seriously. The media world is, I don't want to say the worst, but is probably where you have the biggest resistance against any sort of ideological evolution on the right. Like, I would say that 90% of the people I know who are still never Trump are journalists, for example.
Why do you think that is? Why is that class so particularly hostile?
That's a good question. Now that you bring it up,
armchair psychology. Let's do it.
I mean, they literally make money gazing into their own navel. Like that's how they make a living.
You're speaking to once and future journalists here. I mean, so first of all, and I'm not going to name any names, but like a lot of journalism in this town is pay to play, and like the biggest force against the new right within our coalition is, Wall Street and other big donors. Not all big donors, but many of the big donors, as you guys know. And like, who funds journalism now? That's it's big money. To be clear, at PolicySphere, we raised a little bit of money from private investors, but we intend to be funded from advertising and subscriptions to maintain our editorial independence.
Yeah.
So that's probably a big part of it. A lot of our journalism is punditry, and punditry is sort of like, you talk about the world the way you wish it were rather than the way it is. Opinion journalism, I mean, I don't want to say it's easy. It's hard in terms of like, when I was an opinion columnist, you try to come up with something interesting to say in 800 words every morning. See how well you do. Thank you very much. But so it's not as easy as it looks in terms of the work, but intellectually you can sort of like fall into easy habits. I don't know. I may be completely wrong because I actually haven't thought about that until you asked me the question. But yeah.
Okay, so punditry, bracket that, still most never Trump space. You think we've made progress in the think tank sphere?
Yeah.
Though?
Yeah. it's hard to quantify, right? And
that's your job. Yeah.
And I'm sure you can come up with like 10 counterexamples, and I would agree with you. But overall, yeah, if you'd asked me like 4 years ago, after Trump, after the 2020 election, I mean, like I thought we were just like going back to business as usual.
Yeah.
And clearly we haven't. The GOP, especially the institutional GOP, hasn't been taken over by the new right, and maybe it shouldn't be, because this is another question. Like, does the populist faction inside the GOP represent all of the voters of the party and all of the voters that the party should have? Maybe not. So it also depends on how you define success, right?
Yeah.
You can also say, maybe we shouldn't alienate, everybody who owns a company. Maybe we shouldn't alienate every suburban woman.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we're doing better than I would have thought if you'd asked me 4 years ago.
What are the gaps? What in the theory of change as it's played out so far is the new right missing in its tech stack, for lack of a better term, in order to be effective in moving public policy across the finish line?
I mean, the biggest problem on the right in general, and that's been true for as long as I've been in this world, is personnel. We don't have enough. We don't have enough smart people. I mean, honestly, and the problem is that not so smart people are worse than no people at all, and we also have lots of not so smart people. And so, like that. I mean, there was this study that came out on, and like going back a long time, so not just Trump, how many Democrats do Republican administrations hire? Yeah, the study, versus how many Republicans do Democratic administrations hire? And like going back, like I think all the way to Reagan, like Republicans hire many more Democrats and vice versa.
4 times as many.
4 times. Well, there you go. And it's not by and large, I don't think it's a like a cowardice or like they're selling us out kind of thing. It's a personnel issue. It's like we don't have the people on our side to be like, deputy assistant secretary of nuclear safety or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of these jobs are like technical jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have a good problem for that, multiply Hillsdale by 10, I don't know. But yeah, that's the biggest problem I think we have.
How do you think?
Do you know somebody working on solving the personnel problem in DC?
I think I've heard of some people working on that. Going up chain one more level, what do you think the miscalibrations, heresies, to use a stronger word, are on the philanthropic side of the ledger? Like, how much of, because I could see you going either way on this, where a lot of dysfunctional people in DC blame the donors, and a lot of dysfunctional donors blame the people in DC. So you've described
they're both right.
But go up the chain and say what are the cultural problems in the donor class on the right, other than the obvious answers that prevent some of this reform.
Right. Well, the good thing about having a for-profit is I don't have any donors. I have investors.
Yeah.
So I can unload on donors. You're right. It's like it's both sides. I think so. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to leave out the identifying marks out, but I have a friend of mine who's extremely smart, who's now doing very, very well in tech. Christian, graduates from a very good school, and is like, I want to serve the country. And he goes to work for a think tank here. And this was a think tank that was affiliated with a very rich person. And the rich person essentially like sent a guy from his company to like give a talk on like management or like how to run, an organization. And this is the story my friend tells. I was like, oh my God, this guy has so much more IQ than anybody else I've ever worked with. Clearly, I should be working in business. And like, he went into business and like he went into tech, and he's super successful now. And he's one of the most wonderful people I know. And I think about the like road not traveled, where if he were some sort of political operative, he would be super successful and he would help our side tremendously. Maybe one day he'll be so successful that he'll be fixing the donor problems with money. But the point is, I do have sympathy for the donors who, like, they get a lot of pitches from people who, you know, the nonprofit world is not as, I mean, this is a fundamental problem of the nonprofit model versus the for-profit model, right? When in capitalism, if you don't succeed, you fail, you lose your job, you go home, you go work at McDonald's, or you go do something else until you find something that does succeed. In the nonprofit world, there isn't this discipline mechanism. And so, you know, I have deep sympathy for a lot of donors who are very skeptical of a lot of things that the people in this town tried to sell them. That being said, there's the obvious problems, which is you have a lot of donors whose money is connected to finance, whose money is connected to globalization, whose money is connected to those kinds of things. And so they have a vested interest against the kinds of policies that would be more aligned with where Republican voters are. That's also a big problem, but that's not what you were asking about. And then there's a third problem, and I don't have a good solution for this. I'm going to be very honest. So you have a lot of people. They're wonderful people. They were successful in private business. They were often entrepreneurs. You know, they spent 20 years heads down, you know, figuring out the best way to make, you know, like the best screw that goes into like the rocket. I was going to say the Boeing plane, but we don't want to talk about that. The best mousetrap, and they did that, and they got super rich and super successful, and now they want to give back. Often they're Christian or they're religious, and they want to give back, and they're patriots, and they want to serve the country. They don't understand politics. They don't understand politics at all, because they've spent the next 20 years on something completely different, the past 20 years on something completely different. And they don't really want to learn because they've been super successful. They don't think they have to learn. And so their notion of how politics works is like, you know, they read half an article of the Wall Street Journal every 2 months. Somebody needs to come and fix things. And so all of these institutional dynamics that we've been talking about, the vast majority of donors, even those who are aligned with us, don't understand that at all, which is why most of the money, and the left understands it very well. So most of the money that gets spent on American politics on the right, as you know, is spent on elections. It's like, just elect the good guys and then he'll fix it. And what they don't understand is that even if he is a good guy, which is, you know, 50-50, once he gets there, if all of the people on his staff are of a certain mold, if all of the information he gets from all the think tanks and all the journals and all the newspapers, blah, 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 that's why it's called the swamp, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, even if you're, you know, it's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, like, even if you're wonderful, you're sort of like swallowed by this giant machine that sort of, you know, ensures that you'll either change your positions or fail at achieving the outcomes you want. And like the vast majority of donors don't understand that. They just some do, obviously, because otherwise there would be zero. You wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist, but it's very hard for them to understand this dynamic that the three of us know so well, and that people who have been in this town for a long time know so well. And I don't have a good solution to that problem. because I have preached the gospel many times.
To take a slight detour back to the international angle, often when foreign conservatives come to Washington and kind of come and see what we've got on offer, I'm not even saying necessarily my organization, but the broader ecosystem, they're like, wow, I wish we had this over there.
Yeah.
Are they right to want that? I mean, do you think there are redeeming qualities to the conservative movement as such that we should be more grateful for existing?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, like, you know,
I mean, in contrast with the traditional model in foreign countries, which is that there's a party, and sometimes there's usually state funding for this. You know, state funding for the think tank, state funding for the party in general. So some of that gets allocated to the youth group, and it's all sort of integrated, centrally managed. And like, is the diffused authority structure for how conservative politics and the Republican Party interact with each other in the United States helpful for our cause?
I think so. And there's the biggest difference, and you know, it's the lifeblood is money. The amounts of money on the right are low compared to the left, but the amounts of money in general in U.S. politics are gigantic compared to the amounts of money in France, the UK, Germany, Italy, even relative to GDP, right? It's just because you have this system of public funding, because in general, the sort of nonprofit world is, because of various, mostly tax reasons, really, is more developed in the US. And like, you can't do anything with that money. You know, you think of, I'm going to take an example, a journal like New Atlantis, which is this intellectual quarterly journal of like right-wing philosophers talking about technology. It's wonderful. It could never exist in a country like France. It could never exist in a country like the UK, because they were able to raise a little money. They do this quarterly intellectual journal, and like, people around it read it. Like, it has an impact. It doesn't have an impact in the way that, you know.
But wouldn't something comparable originate in a university in one of those countries?
I mean, you know what universities are like.
Even in Europe, they're all far left.
Well, it's not just that they're far left, although they are. It's that they're super bureaucratic. Mm-hmm. And so it's not even a political thing. It's like, if you want to start a journal with kind of like a quirky idea, you know, that doesn't like fit in a mold, you're still much better off here, like trying to find at least one donor who gets the idea and is willing to get you off the ground, as hard as that is. And there's a whole different conversation about like startup funding and startup grants in our world, which is that's the biggest thing we're missing. But you're still much better off in the US than in any place that I know of in Europe, for sure.
What do you think the biggest opportunity is for this ecosystem in right-wing policy in the coming years? Like, what could they achieve given current levels of organizational acumen?
The biggest question is, you know, what happens to the election? And whether the Trump-Vance ticket, and I use both names advisedly, wins. You know, obviously it's easier to do things if you have the administration that's on your party versus not. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if we lose, a lot of people are going to blame people like us for losing. And there's going to be a big fight. It may end up being a good thing. Like, sometimes, you know, a walk through the desert is a good thing. And if we have an administration, you know, there's probably who knows how many, and, you know, but there's going to be at least some people in the administration who are sort of like sympathetic to those views. And so, you know, do you want me to quantify like what we, you know, I have no idea.
I'm saying in terms of achievement, what's the opportunity?
Achievement of
policy
what?
Achievement.
Policy achievement. I mean, that's the question I've been asking all week to everyone I meet, and I get a different answer every time. And in part, it depends on imponderables, like who wins the presidential, what does the transition look like, what is the role of various actors in the administration, what are the legislative priorities of the administration, All of that depends. I think that there's a growing awareness on our side that we have to do something about the administrative state. That's something about maybe like, taking a sledgehammer to it. That's something maybe taking it over. That's something maybe that would be the best part, which is taking sledgehammer to parts of it and taking over other parts of it. At least that's on the radar of the people on our side, which it wasn't at all before. And that gives me a real cause for optimism that at least in some departments, you're going to have people coming in who have like an idea that they actually want to use the power that they've been given by the American people to achieve policy outcomes. Like, who is that going to be in which departments? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I believe nobody knows. But yeah, I'm optimistic in that sense.
For our members only section, I'm going to ask Pascal some of his fears about the world to come. In order to become a member, you can go to YouTube and search the American Moment YouTube channel. There you can become either a truther or a statesman. And for just a few of your expensed dollars a month, you can hear all of these bonus segments, including getting the episodes 24 hours early and getting invited to special events in DC. I might even ask Pascal a question about why the French are so weird. So, if you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. Pascal, how can people keep up with everything that you're doing?
Well, follow PolicySphere on x.com, formerly Twitter.
What's the website?
It's policysphere.com.
And your personal Twitter handle?
My personal Twitter handle is p_Gobry_en.
Because you also have a French one.
I have a French one, which is private.
Oh, it's private now?
Yeah.
Oh,
it is. I looked at that earlier today.
Yeah, because it's the riskier one.
Yeah. What crazy things do you say on that the English viewers don't see?
Well, you can't know. That's the whole point.
It's all stuff about Albanians. Pascal, thank you for coming to the United States and stopping by our show.
No, thank you for having me.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly enjoyed taping it. Be sure, as always, to go to YouTube to become a member. You can become a truther or a statesman. The membership numbers have been steadily trickling up, and we do appreciate you guys supporting this show. Be sure to go to AmericanMoments.org. You can find the backlog of this show. Soon, new website as well. I hear it's being worked on.
It's a rumor.
Bookmark it now.
It's not been substantiated.
Yeah, fake news, Saurabh here.
Yeah.
Be sure to sign up for AM Fridays, our fall lecture series on Capitol Hill for interns and junior staff. Be sure to reach out to us at AmericanMoment.org/join if you have any interest in getting involved here in DC, or if you're already here and would like to get to know what we have cooking. And thank you guys, as always, for listening. Be sure to rate and subscribe this show. You can go on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and many other platforms. And we will see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.